Good afternoon. Thank you for being here for our Catalyst series for social justice with Kelly Hayes, refusing to abandon our humanity and each other. I'm Lisa Reyes-Mason, Interim Dean of the Graduate School of Social Work, and I use she, her, and sha pronouns. As we begin, I would like to take a moment and recognize that DU and GSSW exist upon the unceded ancestral lands of the Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho peoples. And so we honor our commitment to acknowledging our relationship to the land and to its peoples. I would also, as always, like to thank Ash Aarons and our Office of Community Engagement team for all of the planning that went into today's event. There are so many details that go into these, and we are so grateful to Ash and to Maverick and Max as well. So the Catalyst series for social justice began in 2016 to bring campus and community together to inform, prompt reflection, facilitate dialogue, and spark action for social change. To introduce our guests today, I'm delighted to first welcome and introduce to you Dr. Sofia Sarantakos. Dr. Sarantakos is an educator, a writer, and an organizer. As a faculty member at GSSW, they teach, write, and organize on how the workers and resources of professionalized social change work can be coordinated in service to an abolitionist horizon. As part of this building work, Dr. Sarantakos co-created the Abolitionist Social Change Collective, a virtual space for all paid and unpaid social change workers to convene and strengthen their ability to engage in abolitionist praxis. Dr. Sarantakos is also one of the co-organizers of the transnational group Social Work for Palestine, which is working to forge an unwavering commitment to Palestinian liberation within our field. Prior to entering academia, Dr. Sarantakos was a social work practitioner for 10 years. Dr. Sarantakos and I joined GSSW at the same time, almost 4 years ago. And since we first met, which I remember very clearly, I have felt lucky to know and to learn from them as a dedicated colleague, as a deep and a critical thinker, as a committed advocate for social justice and change, and honestly, as a dear friend. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sofia Sarantakos.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today and to be able to introduce our speaker, Kelly Hayes. Kelly Hayes is a Menominee author, organizer, movement educator, and photographer. She is the host of Truth Out's podcast, Movement Memos, and co-author of the book, Let This Radicalize You, with Miriam Kaba. Kelly is also the creator of Organizing My Thoughts, a weekly newsletter about politics and justice work. Kelly was a co-founder of the Lifted Voices Collective and the Chicago Light Brigade. She has led countless workshops over the years and has trained thousands of people across the country in direct action tactics. Kelly has also served as a grassroots strategist, offering advice and analysis to groups across Chicago and the United States. Kelly's written work can be found in Truth Out, Teen Vogue, Bustle, The Huffington Post, Yes Magazine, Pacific Standard, and her blog, Transformative Spaces, The Appeal, and numerous anthologies. Her movement photography is featured in the Freedom and Resistance exhibit of the DuSable Museum of African American History. Kelly has co-organized major protests and campaigns during some of the most heated political moments of our times, including struggles for Native sovereignty, the fight to save the Affordable Care Act, the mental health movement, the campaign to stop school closures under former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, and the successful effort to win reparations for survivors of police torture in the city of Chicago. Kelly has also organized and led trainings prior to some of the most significant protests in Chicago in recent history, and has helped resistors around the country from Boston College to the Pacific Northwest hone their skills in the run-up to direct actions. This is just a small glimpse into the research, writing, educating, and organizing work Kelly has done over the last decade and beyond. On a more personal note, I'll say that in the same way that abolitionism has been a bright light for me Amid this dark, heavy world, so has Kelly's work. She somehow manages to help us understand the heartbreaking and maddening truths of the world while keeping an open and tender heart, and inviting us and teaching us how to reach for each other over and over and over again, because it's the reaching that matters most. I'm immensely honored to introduce our speaker, Kelly Hayes.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I want to thank the organizers who have been so helpful and accommodating in bringing me here. I'm so grateful for the invitation and to be in this space with you all. I'd also like to thank everyone who's here in person for masking. I deeply appreciate it. I feel comfortable removing my mask to address you all because you're all looking out for my safety and each other's safety. And I just want to name that masking is very much in keeping with the theme of this event. It is part of our refusal to abandon each other, to create safe spaces where we can all be present and all participate. So thank you for honoring that. Before we dig into the subject matter, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that I consider the work we are going to discuss today, the work of organizing, to be sacred work. So out of respect for what's sacred, I wanted to give us a moment to ground ourselves. This grounding exercise is an invitation, not a requirement. So please feel free to engage or disengage from it, depending on what feels right for you. If you are joining me in this exercise, I invite you to get comfortable in your seat and allow yourself to fully arrive in this space and in this moment. Feel your feet against the floor, feel your back against what's supporting you, and without changing anything, feel your breath as it moves in and out of your body. Allow yourself to experience ease in this moment and breathe in some gratitude for the people who inspired you to pursue the work of making change. I invite you to think about someone who made you feel empowered or politically energized or brave, and welcome the spirit of that connection into this space with us. I invite you to think about a protest or action or some other moment of political communion that made you feel like you were doing the right thing and like you were exactly where you were supposed to be, doing what you were supposed to do with the people you were supposed to do it with. I invite you to welcome the spirit of that moment into this space. I invite you to think of someone in whose name you do this work. Today, I am thinking of Chris Giovannis, a dear friend and mentor of mine who passed away recently. I feel called to be more courageous and loving in her absence, and so I welcome her memory and her legacy into this space. I invite you to welcome the love and the gratitude and the grief that we feel for everyone who fuels our struggles into this space. I invite you to touch your heart and thank our ancestors and the organizers whose movements our movements are built upon for giving us a lineage and a legacy to build from. And I would like to thank you for arriving with us in this moment and in this space. Organizing is the work of spinning hope into possibility and possibility into reality wherever we can. It enables us to create light here and now in the tunnel as we navigate the darkness. That is what collective action and protest mean to me. I have given my life to this work, and in turn, this work has given me a life. I believe that our actions in the name of justice embody the words of Diane DePrima, who said, "The war of the worlds hangs here, right now, in the balance. It is a war for this world, to keep it." In addition to being an organizer and a writer, I am also a street medic, which means I am trained to provide first aid and some medical assistance to protesters. Often, this amounts to watching for signs of heat exhaustion and just keeping an eye out for people in need. On some occasions, it requires much more of us, more even than our training can prepare us for. I have encountered those moments when things fall apart and there are no good options. The collective that trained me for this work, Chicago Action Medical, taught me a lesson that has helped me navigate those moments. They say, spread calm. The work of spreading calm is strategic. because panicked people don't think as clearly. They don't listen to each other as well, and they often miss things. Calm allows us to inhabit the moment. It allows us to observe what's happening, assess our resources, communicate clearly with others, and take action together. Being calm helps us bring our best selves forward in difficult moments, and I have found that that helps others to do the same. By spreading calm, we send a message that we need to stay engaged with the moment and each other to get through what's happening. I bring this up because over the years, I have experienced Miriam Kaba's often repeated mantra that hope is a discipline in much the same way. For me, those words are strategic. In dire situations, spreading hope and calm can make the work we do possible. We live in a cynical time when people are expected to accept the unacceptable and consent to the unthinkable. Our passivity, our alienation, and our cooperation can facilitate mass death, brutality, and genocide. To rage against these evils, we need to believe that we have the potential to upend them. This can be daunting because as individuals, we don't stand much of a chance against these forces. And we are taught to measure the world against what we can do as individuals, acting alone. We are taught to assess our potential on the basis of our bank accounts, our job performance, our grades, or even fetishized physical traits. Our role in society is reduced to these assessments, and our sense of our own potential can be flattened within these metrics. We often summarize ourselves without ever finding out what happens when we are part of formulations that could help us thrive. When we are part of formations that could help us thrive. The culture of individualism robs us of the understanding that what matters most is our collective potential. We have no idea what we are capable of until we are working with and alongside people who bring out the best in us. People we can learn from and with. People who believe in us and our collective potential. People who are more invested in each other than they are in this system. Everything we think we know about ourselves can be rewritten or reconfigured when we are acting in collectivity with others. Our potential and humanity's potential forms a completely different horizon, and we realize that we can reject cynicism and fall in love with possibility, because there are, in fact, possibilities worth fighting for. The powers that be don't want us to fight for one another. That is why our entire society is structured in opposition to solidarity. We are social beings divided into units of singular concern. Society tells us that we should care for our immediate family, and that if something goes wrong, it's our problem. No one is obligated to help us. That's the story we're told. Solidarity is dangerous in the best sense because it urges us to consider what we actually owe to each other on a human level. It reminds us that none of us can survive alone. In their book, Solidarity, the Past, Present, and Future of a World-Changing Idea, Astra Taylor and Leah Hunt Hendricks write, fundamentally, we understand solidarity as the recognition of our inherent connectedness, an attempt to build bonds of commonality across our differences. It is an ethos and spur to action rooted in the acknowledgement that our lives are intertwined. Now, something that I think is really important about the book Solidarity is that it differentiates between the types of solidarity that people experience. There is transformative solidarity, which is the stuff that propels movements for liberation. And then there is reactionary solidarity, which powers a different kind of movement. We are seeing both of these forms of solidarity in action in our time. Transformative solidarity broadens our analysis and helps us work across difference to build movements that are more inclusive, more life-affirming, and that pursue a freer, fairer world for all. Reactionary solidarity leads people to embrace scapegoating, such that they only advocate for the rights and well-being of particular sets of people with whom they identify. This can take the form of ethnic supremacy. It can take the form of nationalism. In most cases, it is about clawing back rights and resources for a chosen few while punishing or disregarding others. Frank Wilhoit wrote, "Conservatism consists of exactly one proposition, to wit, there must be in-groups who the law protects but does not bind, alongside out-groups who the law binds but does not protect." It's important to understand this aspect of reactionary solidarity because critics of right-wingers and others who espouse double standards about police violence, the behavior of protesters, or who is deserving of violence are often accused of hypocrisy. Of course, right-wingers are hypocrites, but that designation does not capture the insidiousness of their politics, because what's being described as hypocrisy is actually hierarchy. And when it comes to hierarchy, reactionaries are fairly consistent. Who matters and who does not? Who should inflict violence without consequence? And who should endure it without recourse? Even if you make the reactionary cut and you fall into a category of people who they might have some regard for, your status can be reversed at any time if you advocate for the outgroups, the people whose survival is not a priority for the reactionaries or whose deaths might be preferable in their eyes. I've seen people experience this transition from being someone who reactionaries view as part of their in-group, someone who deserves to have rights, deserves to be safe, deserves to be included in society and its institutions, to being regarded as a traitor, a criminal, and someone who deserves to be punished or killed. This transition can be quite jarring, especially if we don't understand the dynamics of work. It helps to understand that reactionary solidarity is the stuff that helps prop up cultures and systems of oppression. It tells people that their worth and the worth of other people is wrapped up in a political orientation that devalues and denigrates others. Just like transformative solidarity, reactionary solidarity must be constructed. It is not a naturally occurring phenomenon. Though it's easy to get that impression, given that reactionary solidarity is all around us, all the time. The truth is, the political terrain we live in has been manufactured to reinforce and reproduce reactionary solidarity at all times. Even Democrats who position themselves in opposition to the bigotry and extremism of Republicans rely on reactionary politics to maintain order and to ensure that our allegiance to the system and its hierarchies always outweighs our human allegiance to each other. Joe Biden's use of racist language like illegals to promote his border policies and the Islamophobic statements he has made about Palestinians are examples of this phenomenon. In Chicago, we are very familiar with the Democratic use of divide and conquer tactics, given that our mayors are reliably Democrats. Our violent police aren't afraid of our Democratic mayors when they beat protesters or reinforce the racist, transphobic norms of this society. They aren't afraid of our Democratic mayors when they abuse poor people and undocumented people, because those hierarchies are bipartisan under capitalism. Now, in this moment of global upheaval, with so much catastrophe and collapse, we are faced with one party that is quite plain in its reactionary solidarity, and one that seeks to domesticate fascism and make authoritarian consolidations of power more palatable to its base. If making electoral choices were the totality of our politics, this moment would not just be depressing, it would be damning. Fortunately, there is much more to our political life than choosing from a menu of charlatans and monsters. The work of students has reminded us in recent days that we have the power to construct new realms of possibility. When we do not see an obvious path toward refusal, disruption, or transformation, sometimes we have to create one. But above all, I want to emphasize in this moment that our solidarity in these catastrophic times must be grounded in a refusal to abandon one another. That is the core idea that our oppressors must erode in order to compartmentalize the means of survival in a dying world, a world that capitalism is killing. As our planet becomes less habitable and more people are displaced, we are living in a collapsing box where borders and carcerality redraw boundaries of habitability and survival. As this consolidation continues, more and more people will find themselves zoned into death worlds and sacrifice zones. On a long enough timeline under capitalism, the entire world is a sacrifice zone. Bordering, partitioning, and extraction are the apocalypse. Prisons and other sites of detention are the hyper-embodiment of these phenomenon and of what they do to human bodies as well as the natural world. That's why the struggle for prison abolition is a fight for the future. It is the work of making place, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore would say, in defiance of bordering and extraction. It is a refusal to experience collapse on the oppressor's terms, because when it comes to who we can save and what we can heal, the exploration of our collective potential has barely begun. Can we build new worlds together that cannot be crushed or contained by the collapsing box of carcerality? I believe that work is already happening, and that it is up to each of us to find our place and to seed what must be grown. This work is unfolding all the time, in ways that are obvious and in ways that are less obvious. I would ask you to consider, who has this society conditioned you to forget? What suffering have you been taught to think of as inevitable or deserved? What boundaries of identity, opportunity, or proximity help reinforce those standards? Now, I want to ask a more difficult question. I want to travel back in time 5 years. Think about who your politics were allowing you to forget, or whose suffering you were disregarding, or who you were advocating for. Who mattered? Who did you fight for? How loud were you about those injustices at that time? Now, I want you to return to the present. Have you given up on any of the people whose well-being you made noise about 5 years ago? Have you accepted their fates as inevitable or out of your hands? Or have you taken up the cause of people you allowed yourself to ignore or forget back then? What influences have led you to forget, ignore, or advocate for people? What relationships impact those tendencies? I know that the work I am asking you to do is not easy. To buck social norms, to insist that things are not okay when others would simply like to go on with their consumeristic lives, can sometimes mean being a killjoy. In fact, doing this work alone is as excruciating as it is unnatural. We weren't meant to struggle alone. We can only survive together. It is in collectivity that we find joy, artistry, community, and strength. In collectivity, we learn the skills that can help us survive a world that is so often pitted against us. Working together, we can learn how to heal ourselves and each other. Even in the bleakest situations, we can find the next right thing to do. Remember when human disposal is the norm. Care is rebellious. This often means working against authority, and it always means working against the status quo. As a street medic during the NATO protests in Chicago in 2012, I encountered a harrowing situation where police had formed a line in front of an alleyway in close proximity to where a lot of people had been trapped and beaten by police. In the alley, there were seriously injured people. I could see the blood from the street. There were street medics in the alley yelling that they needed more assistance, begging for any other street medics or people with medical training to come help them. But the police were blocking the alley with their bikes, and they were refusing to let me or my group enter the alley. A comrade of mine managed to reason with one of the police, arguing that I should be allowed to enter because of my various certifications. The police officer moved his bike and said, "Just her, just the medic." So I went in, and the police line closed behind me, separating me from my friends who did not know what was going to happen to me. I worked with the people in that alley to assess the injuries of the people the police had beaten. We determined that some of them should not be moved without a stretcher, and we tried calling 911. We were informed that no ambulance would travel beyond the police line or anywhere near it. They asked us to carry the injured out of the other end of the alley and down the street for several blocks to a corner where an ambulance would meet us. We had to make some tough decisions at that time. How urgently did these people need to get to an emergency room? How might we injure them if we attempted to carry them? What would happen to them if we didn't move them? How could we best navigate this highly imperfect work? Well, we made the decisions we had to make, and we carried those people. Some people who weren't as severely injured helped us to transport the others. We watched as they were loaded into ambulances, knowing that we might never hear about what happened next. What I do know is that those people who were bleeding in an alleyway wound up getting medical care instead of languishing in pain for hours before being thrown in a police wagon. I know that in order to ensure that their pain, bleeding, and broken bones were attended to, people had to challenge authority, improvise, and work in concert to generate the best outcome possible. After all, my skills would have been useless if my comrade hadn't leveraged his privilege and negotiating skills to get me on the other side of that police line. And all of us who were medics behind that line needed each other to assess the scene, treat the injured, and formulate a plan. I was needed in that moment, but I also needed everyone around me in order to do anything worthwhile, including some injured folks. As street medics, we needed our training to navigate those moments, including the wisdom of Chicago Action medical trainers like Dick Riley, whose mentorship was crucial to so many of us. We are made and unmade by each other, and our potential is forever bound up in other people. So I want us to think about that defiance and what can become possible when we practice a refusal to abandon in collectivity. When have you resisted authority because you were refusing to abandon someone? Were you alone in that effort? If you were alone, how might the presence of other people have made a difference? What could others have done to help? What would a coordinated effort of refusal have looked like in that moment? If you have participated in collective efforts, how did your co-strugglers make you stronger? I know that many of you are deeply engaged in movement work right now, and that some of you may be approaching burnout. I understand, especially if you have been involved with the recent wave of encampments. Speaking for myself, I have engaged with and co-organized countless protests over the years, which have involved a variety of tactics. I have participated in a number of high-stakes actions, including hard blockades, where we built equipment and then locked ourselves into that equipment in order to shut down roadways and facilities. I have done the kind of protest work that a lot of people might consider big and scary, but I will tell you, nothing is as draining as maintaining an encampment. It's hard to convey to people who haven't experienced it, but most of the time, a high-stakes action has an established timeline. I lock down, or whatever the action calls for. I eventually either get arrested or evade arrest. I go to jail for a while, or I go home. There is usually a totality to the situation that I can get my mind around, even if it drags on longer than I expected or involves unexpected turns. An encampment involves an ongoing, indefinite commitment to a place and to the well-being of the people there. You are constantly troubleshooting. Who will haul away the trash? How will we de-escalate our conflicts? Are the police about to raid us? Can we knock enough stormwater off of these tents to keep them from collapsing? Can I fall asleep in this cold? Are the vulnerable people around us okay? Are their needs being met? And then when you allow yourself to step away for a moment to put your own life back together, you get a call that everyone is in danger again. I know this stress so well, and I have so much respect for the people who have endured it. You don't need me to tell you why we build and rebuild these structures of resistance in spite of the stress and in spite of the fact that police keep knocking them down. You don't need me to tell you that, because we have all seen how this wave of protest has reinvigorated a movement. We have seen that what these protests mean to Palestinian students in Gaza, whose universities have been destroyed. I think we all understand why this work matters and why I am so grateful to everyone who has contributed to it. What I want to take a moment to talk about is how you're doing, because we don't work for our movements. We constitute our movements. Sorry, need a drink of water. I'll say that again. We don't work for our movements. We constitute our movements. If we are falling apart, then our movements are falling apart. Loving the movement means caring for ourselves and each other, and it means modeling for others that we are not disposable. Burnout is a stubborn enemy for organizers. And I want to be specific here because burnout is not merely exhaustion. Sometimes, when we haven't slept well in days, we are testy and hungry and in a bad mood. But if we get a good night's sleep or take a day off, we're fine. That is not burnout. If the problem can be remedied quickly and easily with rest, we're tired, not burnt out. Every burnt out organizer is exhausted, but not every exhausted organizer is burnt out. And Let This Radicalize You, Miriam Kaba and I talk with other organizers like Dean Spade and Sharon Lungo about burnout, which we defined as a profound exhaustion paired with an injury to our dignity or sense of belonging, or a violation of our boundaries. Many organizers work themselves to the point of collapse, and understandably so. We are up against so much and often feel the weight of the world on our shoulders. But our organizing has to reflect our values. Sacrifice is important. But if we are modeling disposability for the sake of productivity, whose values are we replicating? And what are we teaching the people around us by example? If we believe that people should be committed to movements for the long term, we need that commitment to be sustainable. As we say in the book, committed organizers often carry the weight of knowing that they are both a strength and a potential vulnerability to their cause, since their sudden absence or removal could bring important work to a halt. How can we structure our work around these concerns? We can develop relief teams, people who are primed to step in as others become worn out. In Occupy Rogers Park, a formation I was once a part of, weekly tasks were taken up by individuals and involved a buddy team. If I took on a task, someone else would take on the role of check-in buddy, which means they would reach out to me midweek to see how it was going. If I was struggling to make that task happen, they might offer to take it off my hands or reach out to the group to say that we need a new plan to make this task happen. This not only helped prevent people from becoming overburdened, but also prevented the group from being unpleasantly surprised by uncompleted tasks. Valuing the work of social reproduction, or what some people might call women's work, is also important to reducing burnout. During the teachers' strike of 2012, I was part of a volunteer team that read stories to children while parents picketed. Keeping young people entertained while their parents did the important work of protesting was political work, just as providing meals and other help for overburdened organizers is also political work. The bottom line is that we need to treat organizers as human beings whose lives will sometimes interrupt their labor, rather than as batteries to be drained. This requires more than rest, but also rejuvenation. And Let This Radicalize You, Morningstar Ghali talked about how rest is not enough and how we all need rituals to rejuvenate ourselves. One of Morningstar's rituals, at one point in her life, involved walking to a creek every day and sticking her feet in the water during her lunch break. That simple act refreshed her spirit and grounded her in her relationship to the water, a living relative. Later, when she no longer worked near the creek, Morningstar began a practice of putting certain herbs in boiling water each morning on her stove to fill her home with healing aromas. We all need practices that rejuvenate us in order to feel whole. One of the last things I want to talk about today is base building, because while these moments of mass mobilization are important, moving toward the horizon of our values is also going to require a lot of old-fashioned organizing moves. An organizer named Mason Herson Ford taught me a lot about base building, which is the work of building collective power through dialogue, recruiting, education, and collective action. For example, if I want to organize my block and start a block club so that we can advocate for our rights together, I am not going to simply post signs or start a Facebook event page. I'm going to knock on doors and practice my canvassing skills so that I can talk to my neighbors about what matters to them and hopefully get those people in a room together so that we can all talk together and to each other about what we need, want, and intend to do about it. One of the things Mason taught me about base building is the 3 C's of strategic escalation: confidence, capacity, and commitment. To get people into that room to talk about making change, I need to stoke their confidence. Because why would they show up if they didn't believe we could make a difference? There are people in this world who will show up for a fight, even if they don't think it can be won. I love those people, and I have sometimes been one of those people. But that is not how most people think or move. If we want people to take action, we have to get them engaged in the idea that together we have more power to do things we couldn't do alone. The second C is capacity. To make movements happen, we have to pool our collective capacity. This is a tricky one because a lot of organizers don't really understand what they are up against here. Popular discourse often leaves us with the impression that what's preventing most people from taking action is a lack of information, or that they disagree with us, or that they don't have the same ideology. A lot of people are more informed than we'd imagine, or can easily be made so, and plenty of them will agree with us. Also, most people don't have an ideology or care all that much about yours. If they agree with you and believe that change is possible, your next major stumbling block is their capacity. That means you are not competing with their existing ideology, but rather the meaningful and meaningless activities that would otherwise fill their time. You are competing with family dinners and Netflix. That means you have to convince people that what you are doing is worth the sacrifices they'll be making. Personally, I take those sacrifices very seriously because even the time I spend doing nothing is important to me. Time is a finite resource. I love binge watching television. I just do. And I love spending time with my partner. If I'm going to deny myself those things, there has to be a good reason. And the people asking me to do it have to see me as a whole human being and recognize that I don't just need purpose, but also need joy, laughter, and to be held in my humanity. The last C is commitment, because this work will put you through the ringer. So we have to create a culture that regularly invites us in loving and caring ways to recommit to our values, to the work we are doing, and to each other. Celebrating victories can do that. Memorials for the people we couldn't save or are still fighting for can do that. Social experiences that allow us to express who we are in relationship to the work and why we will be sticking with it can also be important. During rallies, I often ask people to turn to someone nearby and make 3 commitments. What were they going to do this week or this month for the cause? Vocalizing and reiterating these things can help, as can reminders of why we won't relent. The last thing I want to talk about before we move into questions is how impossible things can feel. Sometimes we give our all. We encamp, we shut things down, we get mass arrested, we block boats, and we live and breathe the cause. And yet, the evils we oppose are unmoved. The violence of empire and capitalism continue, and our hearts are relentlessly broken. I know this feeling very well. I also know that in my own experience, accepting something terrible as inevitable can be psychologically easier than living in uncertainty. That's one reason I think a lot of people have simply accepted vague notions of environmental doom, because it's easier to simply declare that we're all screwed and proceed with indifference to that idea than to dwell on the anxiety and uncertainty of a world on fire. So I'm going to talk for a moment about the prospect of environmental doom. When Miriam and I were writing Let This Radicalize You, we read a lot of books, manuals, and documents. One of the documents we read was the Global Trends Report of 2020, which was produced by US intelligence agencies for the Biden administration. The report detailed scenarios about how the world might look in 20 years. The scenario we found most interesting involved the widespread success of global justice movements. This is the scenario the report described. The ongoing famines catalyzed a global movement that advanced bold strategic change to address environmental problems. Across the world, younger generations, shaped by the COVID-19 pandemic and traumatized by the threat of running out of food, joined together across borders to overcome resistance to reform, blaming older generations for destroying their planet. They threw their support behind NGOs and civil society organizations that were involved in relief efforts and developed a larger global following than those governments that were perceived as having failed their populations. As the movement grew, it took on other issues, including global health and poverty. Now, I am not saying that an intelligence report should be treated as a blueprint for social justice. Of course it shouldn't. But I am saying that the people tasked with maintaining the norms of empire at all costs can imagine us winning and transforming the world. If they can imagine us winning and we can't, then we have some serious imaginative work to do. These agencies are not in the business of giving our movements too much credit or giving humanity the benefit of the doubt. They are as cynical as any human being on this earth, but they formulated a scenario in which justice movements won and the world was transformed and informed their bosses of that possibility. Our creativity, which is much greater than theirs, can surely enable us to envision even grander transformations and potentially bring them into being. On a bad day, we may not feel like a threat to the current order of things, but the people tasked with maintaining that order recognize that our love, our solidarity, and our collective commitments could upend everything. And if this was not true, they would not be so determined to crush our movements and repress us. Repression is daunting, but it also represents an understanding of our potential. We mustn't lose sight of that potential, no matter what breaks in or outside of us. That potential and our courage are always there, waiting to be found in each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that powerful talk. I mean, honestly, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking I don't even know how to segue, just because there's so much to dig into. I think something that I'll just say before we get into the Q&A is that, you know, like I said in my introduction, right, it's so much of why I've been drawn to your work for so many years is because there's the gutting honesty and analysis paired with the tenderness and the care and the holding of how we get through the gutting, heartbreaking pieces, right? You name how the social, economic, and political landscape funnels us toward abandonment, how we have to desperately fight against that. But then also you talk about how we need to reach for ourselves too, to push our understandings of the world, our politic of solidarity, and broaden and strengthen not just the way that we care for each other, but for ourselves. So thank you for that. We're going to jump into Q&A, and we have some questions that were already prepared, and we'll likely, I think, toggle to things that are in the room and also for Zoom. I know we've got some folks on Zoom, so we want to make sure that those folks have an opportunity to join the conversation. So we'll start with one that was given in advance. Kelly, this question is, how do you regulate your day-to-day intake of knowledge and news?
So I overconsume news and information, which I don't think will surprise anyone. And this is something I was actually talking to the students at the encampment about yesterday. Part of that has to do with my cognitive style. Now, cognitive styles are something I learned about earlier in the pandemic because I was deeply distressed. I was distraught by how some of the people I knew were handling the fact that we weren't supposed to go anywhere, and that if we did, we had to wear masks, and that we had to take all these precautions to protect each other. People were acting in ways that weren't just out of alignment with my values, but were out of alignment with their values and with the values of their community. And prior to that, when I was kind of an early alarm raiser, when people didn't want to yet accept that the pandemic was actually coming to the United States in a big way, some people I knew were terrible to me. They were just hurtful. And I couldn't understand why. And in my heart, I started to do that thing where people's behavior is kind of incomprehensible. And so I was sorting them into good and bad. Like, oh, they're just a crappier person than I realized. Maybe they're just actually a bad person. Maybe they don't actually care about other people or their family or whatever. But I knew on an analytical level that that couldn't be true. It couldn't be that simple because people are rarely that simple. Dividing people into categories of good and bad, it just usually isn't the answer. So I started researching, and I read a lot about political psychology that I hadn't before. And I read a book called The Psychology of Pandemics by Stephen Taylor, and it was so helpful. One of the things he talked about is how ill-equipped we are to process annihilatory threats. And that made so much sense to me because I feel ill-equipped to deal with human consciousness like on a Tuesday, right? Just like any old day of the week. This is way too much. How am I supposed to process all of this? So, of course, we're ill-equipped to process things that could just completely rewrite our reality and destroy our worlds. And so we all have different ways of coping with that. We've developed different cognitive styles that help us sort of order our reality. And one of those cognitive styles is called being a monitor. I'm a monitor. So the way I deal with my discomfort with uncertainty is I consume as much information as possible so that that spot in the middle that is uncertain to me, if I understand everything around it, I feel a little safer, a little more grounded in my navigation of the thing I can't know because I know all this other stuff. Now, this was useful to me and my community early in the pandemic. The Chicago Freedom School went remote before basically anyone else because they listened to me when I wrote them a factual appeal about what was going to happen in terms of the pandemic and that shutdowns were going to happen no matter what. So people who knew me and believed me took important steps. One of my friends shuttered her business and saved her financial life by doing so. So this was useful. This also could have been catastrophic. What if I didn't have good discernment, for example, and I was constantly consuming information to comfort myself? I could have consumed conspiracies. I could have consumed bullshit. And I could have been a walking, talking advocate for those things, as a lot of people became. So these coping strategies are neither good nor bad necessarily. It's a matter of how they manifest, right? And what other qualities we have that they might intersect with. Another one of those styles is called being a blunter. So a blunter is someone who, if they encounter a supposed annihilatory threat, they look behind them at the experiences they've had. Do their prior experiences tell them that this makes sense or is real? Do what they have been told to expect from the future validate this in any way? Do their touchstones, the people and information sources they trust, are they verifying this information? And if the answer is no to all of that, they throw up a wall. That isn't real. That's not really going on. Like the rest of my understanding would ground me in that being real if it were. And they don't let themselves process it. And that may sound wild, but doesn't that kind of make sense on a really basic level? That I would look to the past, I would look to what I've been told to expect in the future, and I would look to the people and information sources I trust most and take them as my guide. Most of the time, that's probably going to serve you if you have good information sources and good people in your life. Again, how does this intersect with the touchstones and the other qualities that you have? So early on, one of my friends got deeply worried about me because of all of the information I was consuming. And I didn't know all of this about cognitive styles and how we approach things, but I did understand what I was doing enough to tell her I would be so much less calm if I weren't reading all of this, if I weren't trying to understand what was happening. And so I at least knew that about myself. So I think part of the thing is just kind of recognizing who we are, what comforts us, how our minds work, And then, trying to establish reasonable boundaries, for the patterns that make sense for us, right? Because my information consumption has to have its limits, even within my unusual sort of habits, just as putting stock in our touchstones as our guides has to have its limits. I can't count how many people told me in those days that they had a nurse friend who told them this wasn't going to be a big deal, right? Sometimes the people who we can reliably ask questions don't know what's going on. So I think it's being very in touch with yourself and sort of in touch with sort of the impact the world is having on you. Are you getting enough sleep? Is your consumption of information overwhelming you more than not knowing would be? Are you neglecting other tasks or people for the sake of being fixated on these things? One another thing that came up yesterday when I was talking to folks at the encampment was that a lot of folks knew people who were informed, who understood the severity of the environmental crisis, but who didn't talk about it a lot, right? And this makes sense within the span of that being an annihilatory threat that folks just don't know how to process. And then we know some other people, right, who consume information about it all the time. And maybe they're talking about that information all the time. I'm one of those people. I'm really fun at parties. So are we necessarily improving the situation by doing either of those things? No. So I would also ask, what am I doing with this consumption of information? How is it serving me or serving others? I try to put the information that I consume en masse to use. I consider myself a researcher, and I'm a researcher for the sake of my organizing, for the sake of my journalism, and for the sake of having informed conversations with people in communities I care about. And sometimes I do have to check in with myself about, am I consuming this difficult information in a way that is facilitating the good I want to do? Or am I just kind of punishing myself by kind of being in a loop here of just consuming pain because I don't know how to stop looking at it? Because all of this can be real. So I think, we have to check in with ourselves a lot about what's going on, about what we're doing, about what it means to us, and that there are no easy fit answers for all of us. We're all different. And that as long as you are doing the good that you can, and as long as you are doing your best to take care of yourself while doing that good, I would also say trust yourself a bit about what makes sense for you, because we're all different.
Thank you for that. Something that maybe I want to draw out that connects to the title of your talk and being in the space today is that, talking about recognizing how we are consuming information, but also being thoughtful about understanding that everyone else is going through that as well and struggling with processing information. And how does that, something that struck me when you were responding just now, as I heard you say in Chicago several years ago, is you can't organize people that you have disdain for. And I actually share that with my students quite often. And so recognizing also that while we're struggling with all of this intake, so is everyone else. And how do we foster patience for that? So that's just something that really struck me in what you were saying. Do we have a Zoom question, Maverick? Perfect. Awesome, thank you. Okay, this question is, as you mentioned, encampments are one of the biggest challenges and movements. How do we support each other's well-being, especially as people burn out and become reactive?
That's an excellent question. For one thing, I think it's very important to check in with people about, are they eating? Are they sleeping? The real fundamental stuff that we all need to do. And if you find yourself or others making a lot of excuses for why these very basic things aren't happening, remind them that if they are not well, we are not well. Our movements are not well. Sometimes it's impossible to get people to care about themselves in the ways that we would hope. Sometimes we have to resort to emphasizing that caring for ourselves is part of our movement work. It's part of our discipline. It's part of our revolutionary discipline. Because if we destroy ourselves, we are destroying a part of the movement. And we are also modeling disposability to others. And that's the thing that helps me the most, when I'm going too far and I need to check in with myself, I remember that there are people around me who are watching what I'm doing. We all are constantly learning by imitation. It's part of being human. So even if you don't think of yourself as a leader, you are modeling important behaviors all the time to other people that will likely be imitated. So what are we modeling in terms of how much our lives matter? In terms of what kind of lives we deserve to live? Are we batteries to be drained, or are we people who deserve care? Do we want to die for our movements or live for our movements and live for each other? These questions help put me in check when I am overdoing it, because believe me, I have been there. I have destroyed myself for this work. Years ago, when I became disabled, I could barely get up and walk due to the excruciating pain I was in. I took painkillers and sometimes would take a shot of Jack Daniels to get myself to be able to go facilitate an action or to run a training. I went way too far for this work because I loved this work and I convinced myself that that was right and righteous. And I wish that people around me had felt comfortable, felt like they could intervene and say, you're teaching the wrong thing. Did I do some important stuff during that time? Absolutely. Did I also model something toxic to people who may have emulated it? Yes. And I never want to do that again, because when the people around me are in excruciating pain, I want them cared for. But I will tell you what my community did do for me that helped remind me of my place in all of this and what we should be doing for ourselves and each other. And that's when my insurance stopped paying for my physical therapy, which was basically my hope of getting out of pain and regaining my mobility. They said I wasn't making enough progress to justify continuing to pay for it. My organizing community established a GoFundMe and crowdfunded to make sure I could keep going to physical therapy until we could force my insurance to pay again. And that shook me and touched my heart. And it also gave them the in that they needed to have some of those conversations. Because now they were doing this big thing for me, so they felt like they could make some asks. And one of my friends who was part of bottom lining that said, now I need you to prioritize your body more. Like, we're going to pay for this care, and we want the care to come first. We want you to approach it with the discipline that you approach everything else. And I immediately saw what I'd been doing. And I also saw that they hadn't felt comfortable saying that to me until they had this stake to kind of name. I didn't like that either. And I wanted to change that too, because that's not the kind of organizer I want to be, the kind of friend I want to be. It's certainly not the kind of leader I want to be in my community. So I would say that we need to have relationships where we can approach each other honestly. You need to check in with yourself about, do the people I am accountable to have traversable paths to challenge me or let me know that I need to change something? How do I react when people do intervene in some way? Do I react in a way that ensures that that won't happen again? How do I handle it when I don't think people are doing the right thing for themselves or others? Do I talk to that person in a good way, or do I just talk to somebody else? I think we all fall into that trap sometimes. We're not helping or healing anything when we're just facilitating a culture of gossip and complaint. We need to be able to talk to each other. We need to be able to experience conflict as generative and positive. A young person pushed back on something I said at the encampment yesterday, and I appreciated it so much because it ushered in a layer of complexity to the conversation that I wasn't tapping into, that was real. We need to be able to welcome that. We need to be able to appreciate it when people say things that are hard. And when we find that I just can't right now, I can't welcome this thing this person's trying to give me, we need to be able to shut things down and say, you know what, I'm not in a place to have this conversation in a good way right now. I want to do that, but I think I need to go drink some water. I need to go take a nap. I need to finish this task in front of me, and then I'm going to come to you and we can talk about this. I also think resources are really important because this society does not give us any of the skills we need. We are completely not conditioned to do any of this. We are conditioned into individualism and in a toxic alienation from each other. So there are resources that can help us learn the skills we need. One of them is the In It Together toolkit, which was co-created by Interrupting Criminalization and I believe it's Dragonfly Partners. This is an incredibly important resource that I have returned to again and again to talk about the culture that we're building around conflict, about what our shared values are, about how we address these issues together as they come up. Again, these aren't skills that we're just walking around with. And so I would say, look up the toolkit, look up In It Together toolkit, and have a talking circle about what's in there, about some of those ideas. Get those conversations started in your encampment or in your community. And that'll give you a jumping off point for a lot of things. I also recommend Fumbling Towards Repair, which is a workbook by Miriam Kaba and Shira Hassan. And one of the tools in that workbook is the clearing circle. I don't know if any of y'all have ever participated in a clearing circle, but it can be so liberating to just sit down in a circle with other people and name what hurts. Just have a go around and naming what hurts, and we all just listen. Just listening can be a radical act. We are not conditioned to do it right. A lot of people think they're good listeners, and most of us aren't. It's a skill we haven't spent the time honing unless we have been really intentional about it. A lot of times we get to the point where we're thinking about what we're going to say next or why we're pissed off, and we stop listening. We need to work on those skills together. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore has said that, the rule against crosstalk in AA made her a much better organizer because it got her grounded in the act of listening to people, even when they were being annoying, even when they were pissing her off, with an intention and understanding that this listening was about collective survival, so I have to do it and it matters. That is so important. So getting in a circle, naming what hurts, taking a moment to process that, and then maybe having a go round about what am I going to change? What am I going to do differently this week or today or moving forward to make sure I'm in alignment with my values based on what I've learned from this experience of listening. Making space to reshape the way that we approach conflict and the way that we approach each other when things are difficult. This is how we transform harm. This is how we transform our spaces into places where we heal together and where we live our values rather than just getting frustrated with each other, because we can do that anywhere.
Thank you for that incredibly honest and vulnerable sharing of things that you've experienced. I just want to shout out the folks at the Auraria encampment here in Denver who might be online, folks here in this room who are part of DU's encampment and have also participated in the Auraria encampment, who I know are just really feeling those words and will carry them with them to those spaces. And also, just as someone who's been at the camp since the start of it, I just want to say to those students, you're prefiguring the world. You're doing incredible, incredible work. I see you doing that difficult work. Kelly has seen you do that incredible work. And so I just want to shout you all out and make you feel that. There was a question about embodied healing, but I think so much of what you said really does kind of address that. So maybe what I'll kind of jump to is this great question that came in about how should students organize now that the school year is over? Thinking about that timeline.
It's a really good question. And I feel that it's a position that a lot of us have been in, even if we weren't student organizers, in terms of these inflection points, these moments of significant transition. Because I'm thinking, for example, about Occupy Chicago. So Occupy Chicago was different than a lot of the other iterations of Occupy in that a bunch of cities had these encampment spaces, right? These liberation zones where people did work very similar to what many of you are involved with right now or are supporting right now, where people had encampments and they had workshops, they had skill shares, and they would stage protests out of that space. Marches would begin there, actions would be planned. It was a community, it was a home base, and it was a symbol, right? Back in 2011, the tent was like this floating signifier that so many hopes and so much potential was projected on, in many cases meaning different things, vastly different things to people, but that's another story. So everyone wanted an encampment. It was goal number one if you were part of this movement. So Chicago folks rallied together and we tried to claim a space. We tried to take a place called Congress Plaza, and we tried to do it twice. We took 300 arrests trying to take that space. And then we accepted that it wasn't going to happen. It's pretty hard-headed, right? 300 arrests. I think about it all the time because I also think about arrests being a resource, just like money, just like anything else you have a finite amount of before the ways in which you move are deeply affected. And so we put ourselves in this disadvantage really early on by taking those 300 arrests rather than kind of reading the writing on the wall. But once it kind of got through our thick skulls that we weren't getting an encampment, we had to figure out what to do. What did it mean to be part of the movement if we didn't have the encampment? And what we did was we spent a lot of time sort of holding space. We had kind of an area that we claimed, even though we didn't have a camp there, in the financial district, Jackson and LaSalle. But more importantly, we staged actions all the time. We had our regular general assemblies that we gathered for each night. I was there almost every night for quite a while, but people came when they could. And we had a democratic process around making movement decisions about what we were going to do. And if you wanted your action to be sanctioned, to have the approval of the General Assembly, if you wanted to be able to say that, you wrote a proposal and you came to a meeting. But anyone who was part of the movement could autonomously act and stage a protest or bring an Occupy presence to a local struggle. As you can imagine, there are drawbacks to this too, but that autonomous action made our group in Chicago extremely powerful. We weren't one place where we could be brutalized, where we were caught up in the extreme difficulty of maintaining an occupied space. We had freedom of movement. We were everywhere. And where we went, the cameras also followed because they were very interested in Occupy as a movement at that time. Looking back, I really think it was one of Rahm Emanuel's great miscalculations as mayor that he did not let us take that plaza. It was October. We would have been in serious trouble before long. The weather would have broken us if the police didn't. And certainly the strain of maintaining an encampment, because we had no idea what we were getting into in that respect either. Most people don't when they step into that. It's a type of action that has so many unforeseeable consequences. It's very hard to know what you're getting into. If they had let us take that space, we would have been very busy trying to hold it, and we would have been ground under pretty hard, like a lot of our co-strugglers nationally were. But because we didn't have that going on, we did so much great work. And I don't want to idealize Occupy. It had many flaws, but we brought a lot of human power to a lot of front lines in our city. We made the fight against austerity much stronger. We compromised a bad mayor again and again. And without the militancy of Occupy, the Chicago teacher strike of 2012 would not have had its militancy. The fight for our public health clinics would not have had their militancy. And the resistance to NATO in 2012 would not have had that same militancy. I think that we helped shape the next decade of protest in our city. And I know that we trained up new generations of folks who moved on to much better structured struggles that had a much better analysis than we had had. So many folks from Occupy became a part of Black Lives Matter. So I think that it's really important to think about the potential of whatever's happening, even when what's happening is not advantageous to us, right? Folks have encampments right now, and those are powerful. Losing those, whether it's through a raid or the end of the school year or whatever it is, it hurts, it's hard, it's a loss. And also, what potentials are revealed when we are taken out of a particular context? So if it's that I am going home for the summer, what are the possibilities in my community? What can I do in a local level? How can I plug in elsewhere? How can maintaining our connections across a broader area be useful to us? What is the potential there? And another example that I'm going to give here that I talked to some of the young folk about yesterday is Occupy Sandy. I don't know if all of y'all are familiar with this, but Occupy ran on listservs. It ran on Google Groups, and that was awful. I hated those Google Groups so passionately, and people would fight in them, and it was miserable. And when the movement kind of petered out, those communications channels died off, and I stopped getting all of those annoying emails, and it felt like a real upside to a rough situation. Then Hurricane Sandy happened, and all of those comms channels reopened. And you had people involved with Occupy from all over the country using all of our connections that we had to each other to coordinate a massive, one of the most consequential mutual aid efforts of my lifetime here in this country. Folks went to New York and they helped save lives, and they helped people rebuild their lives who had been abandoned by this government. And we did it with this tool that we'd come to absolutely loathe, but it was a resource we created without even foreseeing the potential of what we'd made there. So I think it's important to ask questions like, what have we built? What infrastructure have we created? What relationships do we have that we didn't have before? What are the potentials of all of this? And that will help us answer the next question, which is, where does our work go now? Where does the energy go? Where does the power go? So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, so many things I think in there for all of us to wrestle with around when one chapter closes or a timeline closes, what's the next right thing to do? That's so helpful. Thank you so much. I'm going to pivot to a Zoom question. And this kind of changes, moves us out of what we've been talking about, particularly about movements, but this idea of kind of like imagining. And so the question is, sometimes I have a hard time imagining how things could look different. Can you please share more with us about what you imagine for a transformational future? What could our society look like if we replaced capitalism? Is there an example of that future you see in our current day?
This is such a great question. And it's one I really wouldn't contend with when I was younger. I was an asshole in a lot of ways. I knew everything, I wasn't an organizer for a lot of years when I was an activist. I didn't have a craft of relationship building. There was a lot I didn't want to be bothered with. I wanted to be really good at direct action, and I wanted to help other people be good at direct action. And I didn't want to really do more than that. And I remember being out for drinks after a meeting one night with some folks, and one of my co-strugglers saying like, but yeah, what does it look like when we're free? What does it look like? And I just kind of rolled my eyes. I'm like, I have no idea. I have no idea what that would be like. And she was like, well, like, what are you even fighting for then? I'm like, I'm fighting because I'm mad. Like, I'm a wrecking ball. Point me at the bad guys. Like, that's what I'm here for. And this made sense to me. Then some years go by, and I was working with Miriam. And Miriam Kaba is the person who really challenged me to make the transition from being an activist to being an organizer. Like, I had some organizing skills when we met, but I wasn't truly an organizer because I wasn't really committed to the craft of relationship building. And yesterday somebody asked me about like what radicalized me. And I think radicalization is this thing that happens in stages, right? It happens in a lot of ways to us over time. But the most important way that I was radicalized came so much later than what I thought was sort of the formation of my politics. Organizers are accountable to a community. Organizers recognize that we have to build relationships, not simply with people we want to build with people we would like to know. We have to be able to do the work of collective survival and transformation with people who aren't of our own choosing, people we would never otherwise associate with, people who piss us off. And that takes skills. That takes the development of listening skills. That takes understanding that patience is a practice and not a feeling. I didn't want to do any of that. I wanted to do direct action, and I wanted to, I wanted to be one of the cool kids, I think, looking back, because that was cool to me, and I wanted to spend my time on that stuff. But working with Miriam, I kept getting pulled into these positions of leadership, these moments of leadership, and these moments of mentorship when people were looking to me. And Miriam clarified to me that if I wanted that, if I wanted to inhabit that, then I actually did have to put up with people in these ways that I hadn't had to, that it was okay, that I was unwilling to when I was a little more niche in my activism. And I needed to be able to give people confidence that we were moving towards something worthwhile. Remember, I talked about confidence and capacity and commitment. How am I going to organize a group of people if they say, well, what does it look like if we win? And I'm like, hell if I know. Like, is that inspiring? Does that make people want to get together and give up their precious time to do this work? Does it make them want to commit to anything? And she was like, why don't you know what freedom looks like? It's like, I haven't seen it. I haven't felt it. It's like, well, what would it look like? You have to try to engage with that. You have to try to answer that question. I did not answer that question to myself until my late 30s. That's when I really got to that point of imagining what the world could be. What helped me to do that, more so than things that are happening in the present, and there are things happening in the present that are deeply inspiring. There are land-based solidarity movements that I find incredibly hopeful. There's so much good work, but what was most helpful to me was looking to the past and looking to my ancestors. One of the reasons I struggle to imagine good things at this time, or that I did at least deeply struggle, is that I was so aware of everything that was wrong with the world. And I was so overwhelmed by all these kind of doom scenarios. And to my mind, I had this mentality that it doesn't matter if we can win or not, because the only way it's actually worth living in this world is if we're fighting for each other and fighting for something better, even if I don't know what that is, even if I'm leaving that up to people I think are more creative than me, more idealistic than me. But I had the example I needed for what it means to survive the unthinkable in my own people. The Menominee people lost 3/4 of our population in just 1 year to smallpox. We endured decade after decade of siege and impossible survival. And we have the lived history of how we did it. We survived through reciprocal care and principled leadership. And white academics who have studied my people have even come to this conclusion. This is not an idealization. There's a book called Siege and Survival, and the guy who wrote it states plainly that the Menominee people survived into the reservation era through principled leadership and reciprocal care. It was un-Menominee to let someone starve if you had food. The idea that we all have value and that it is incumbent upon all of us to keep as many of us alive as possible for as long as possible informed our culture of survival. And that made everything else that was good between us possible. Not allowing anything to erode those values. And a few years ago, there was a terrible storm on my reservation. The power was knocked out for a whole lot of people. And I was watching in our Facebook groups, in the comms channels I was in, as people mobilized and organized to get generators to the school, because that's where the biggest freezers were, and to make sure everyone knew to bring their freezer items to the school, because people had these huge stocks of meat and whatnot that were going to get them through the winter. And so everyone worked together to make sure we could preserve the means of survival for our people. I know what the world I want looks like because I see the values that inform it. And I see the ways that it manifests even in this terrible, messy society that doesn't work anything like I think it should. A society based on reciprocal care isn't just possible, it has existed. And even amongst peoples who've had their practices perverted and beaten out of them and criminalized, we still see manifestations of these life ways. These ways in which people have survived the violence of empire. These ways in which people have overcome the violence of individualism and alienation. So I would say to figure out what that looks like to you, what freedom looks like to you, what a transformed future looks like to you, look to the places where the world you want has existed in various ways, where people have lived those values and survived together because of it. I only exist because of my people's practice of reciprocal care, because of their refusal to let each other starve. And in that past, I see the future. Indigenous people, Black people, Native people have been building new worlds as the worlds they know collapse around them for as long as we have experienced the violence of empire. We have this capacity. We have this creativity. We need to feed it. We need to nourish it. And we need to do the imaginative work together of figuring out how do we prefigure it here and now? How do we practice it between us in ways we can make manifest? And I see people doing that in the encampments. And it's so heartening. You know, Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, where life is precious, life is precious. Being precious to each other is how we fight for the future. It's how we inform the future. And so I hope that's helpful.
I think that's more than helpful. I think just putting so plainly that the horizon that so many of us in this room, online, elsewhere are reaching for is not unknown. It's not unknown to us in so many ways in queer communities and other communities. So putting that so plainly, I think, is so important for all of us to kind of carry with us and remember. I think I want to end. I certainly don't want to exceptionalize higher education and academia in any way because it's a workplace like any other. But given all that's happening across the country in this space and where we are right now and what's happening outside on Carnegie Green here and in our area, I do want to honor this question around what your thoughts are on what obligations do professors, also just kind of name too that this will be the last question before we leave for the evening, and there will be food outside as well. But want to end with this important question about the space that we're occupying right now, which is that what obligations do professors and administrators have to their students as they face backlash for acts of protest?
I appreciate this question. And I really think there's something universal in it. What obligations, what do we owe to each other? That's the basis of solidarity. What do we owe to each other as people? And when we have any kind of institutional power, it is incumbent upon us to make our access to power and our relationship to it part of the answer to that question. Just as the students are doing right now. Students want divestment, but what is the urgency behind that demand? It is that there is an ongoing genocide. And so they are leveraging their relationship to an institution they have a stake in as a way of making demands that uplift the need to fight and end that genocide. And these students deserve our solidarity and support. So whatever our positionality is, You know, whether you're a movement journalist like me, whether you're a professor at the school, what does your positionality give you access to? And what does it enable you to do that means something to people, that means something specific to the cause? Now, seeing professors putting themselves on the line in defense of students, that's not something I envisioned. And it's been such a beautiful thing to see. And I think a lot of things have made that possible. We have been going through waves of movement building over the last decade and a half. Profound changes have taken place. I don't have to tell you all that 10 years ago, this movement that we're seeing now of encampments on campuses would not have occurred. It simply would not have, because the repression of Palestine solidarity activism has been so extreme, it would have been unthinkable to see all of this movement on campus, to see this kind of visible participation, solidarity, and this vocal support of people who are leveraging their position, whatever that is, whatever their influence is in their community, to make that more possible, to make it more likely that people can do this without experiencing the same level of repression that they have in the past. We've all played a part in that by being vocal on this issue and by touching our organizations in whatever way we can around this issue. Now, what does it mean to support students when you're in the academic role? I know professors, I know one professor who canceled final projects, just canceled it and was like, we're not doing it. This university had y'all attacked by the cops last week. Like, I don't even know how to reckon my role within the system right now, but I'm canceling, I'm not putting this obligation on you. And if you needed this for some reason to salvage your grade, come talk to me. We'll figure something out. But this pressure is just gone, not imposing this on people so long as, you know, this institution is compromising its own values and hurting its students. I refuse to make their lives harder right now. That was a very powerful act. What are the ways we can bend, break, or redefine the rules at any given time to support people and what they need to do? What is really within our power? What is really within our creativity? And then what acts of defiance are we willing to engage in? What risks are we willing to take? And the more of us that take a risk, the less inherently dangerous it becomes. And I want us to understand that fundamental truth of organizing. We create safety by doing things together. So one thing I think that academic folk can do right now is talk to each other about what the potentials are. What are we all willing to do? Because they're not going to fire us all, right? We hope not. Then I'm saying, if you don't know what those boundaries are, talk to your colleagues. Where is the line? What lines do we think we can safely cross here? And what are we willing to do that's maybe a little unsafe, but if we do it together, we all feel a bit better about doing it. I can't tell you where those lines are. We are all carrying different burdens. We are all up against different things. I, for example, have not put my body on the line recently. I'm not putting myself between the police and the folks who are in the encampment, however much I feel moved to do it, because my body is not in a place that can tolerate the rigors of arrest right now. So I have to figure out what is accessible to me. What risks can I take? What discomfort can I endure? The answers are going to be different, but they're there. There is always something we can do to move towards the horizon of our values. And that's at the heart of active hope, right? That's what Joanna Macy teaches us about hope, that made hope even something I could engage with in a serious way. Because again, I'm a recovering misanthrope. I've really struggled with some of these ideas over the years, but the idea of hope is a discipline. The idea that no matter what's going on, no matter how bleak things are, I can decide what is it that I want to see happen, or what values do I want expressed in relation to that thing? And what step can I take? What move can I take right now toward that horizon. There's always a move. There's always a next right thing to do. No matter how many avenues are closed, there's always a next right thing to do. So I would say challenge yourself. Challenge yourself, convene with your people, figure out what chances you can take, and move toward it together.
Kelly, thank you so much. What an incredible 90 minutes with you, all of your wisdom and stories. We appreciate it so much. I guess I'll just end by saying all power to the students, and there's so much for us to be reconciling with in this space, in this container, as people connected to this institution. Thank you so much again. Food is outside for everyone. Please go enjoy, and thank you so much for joining us here and virtually.